what makes them a marine plywood as opposed to just a regular interior decorative plywood is that they use lots of phenolic resin glues, fully saturated phenolic resin glues, and multiple plies. In the case of the 3/4 inch, we're looking at typically 13 or 15 plies per panel, which makes them very stiff, very rigid, very flat.
Hey, welcome back to another chapter in the rebuilding of the Western Flyer. I'm Chris Chase with the Western Flyer Foundation, and it's been a few weeks since we took a look at the boat project. And in those few weeks, there's been a ton of great work done on the project. Tim and Pete finished up the bulwarks on that aft working deck, and Ryan and Jordan have actually finished up all the rest of the hull planking, all the odds and ends, the bunging, the fairing, anything left to do with that external hull planking. They even leveled the boat fore and aft and got the permanent water line struck onto the boat. But in this episode, I want to talk about plywood. We've chosen to put 2 layers of 3/4 inch or 18 millimeter plywood down on the working deck and the foredeck. And in this episode, I just want to talk about how we made those decisions, how we treat plywood, how we install plywood, all the things that revolve around putting plywood on a wood boat deck. The original deck on the Western Flyer is what we call a corked laid deck. That means individual boards running fore and aft fastened to each individual deck beam, and then some kind of corking material down between each board to kind of harden up the deck and keep it waterproof. In the case of the Western Flyer, it was a 2 3/4 inch wide, 2 1/4 inch thick Douglas fir deck with a layer of cotton corking down in there and a layer of oakum. And then each seam on the deck, in a fish boat particularly, is filled with a hot pitch that burns its way down into that oakum layer and gives it a nice structural waterproof deck. In the rebuild of the Flyer, we opted to go with a totally different direction though. Same look in the end, but a different construction method. We opted for 2 layers of 18 millimeter or 3/4 inch marine plywood, glued down and screwed down. The second layer glued and screwed to it. Nice 4-inch screws going through both layers down into the deck beams. That entire layer covered over with a layer of 10-ounce epoxy and fiberglass cloth. And then a nice overlay over that. You know, this is a 2 3/4 by 1 inch, nice vertical grain Douglas fir board. That will be the overlay of the deck, and then rubber between. So it'll give us the waterproof we're looking for and the nice traditional looking deck. We opted to go with this method over that traditional laid deck, just exactly for that, for the waterproof deck. You know, so much scientific equipment is going down into the fish hold, ROV, computers, research equipment, that we can't afford any leaks whatsoever. So, though this deck has been around a long time and it's maintenanceable, you can reef out the material and recork it, and it'll last years and years and years. But it's not 100% waterproof. And this plywood fiberglass overlay method is. So it'll give us the waterproof deck we're looking for, but it'll give us that nice traditional overlay to look like an original hardwood deck. Before any plywood can be permanently installed on the deck, the underside of each sheet that will end up making the bottom layer needs to be painted. First 2 coats of primer, followed by 2 top coats. With all of the prep work done, the patterning and fitting can begin. Fitting plywood to a deck is a rather straightforward process, but to guarantee a nice tight fit, skeleton patterns are made for each individual piece. The idea of making a skeleton pattern I think is pretty self-explanatory,
We use 1/8" door skin plywood cut into strips and glued together using a hot melt glue gun. You're basically making an exact template of the hole you need to fill. If you don't have access to a hot melt glue gun, you can always screw the strips together using 1/2" panhead screws. The only thing you have to remember when you're cutting out your piece is to cut to the inside of your layout line. If you don't, your final piece will grow by the width of the line. And if you do all of your layout correctly and you cut the plywood out carefully, there should be very little fitting needed. The next step in building a plywood deck is to seal all the plywood edges. In the process of making plywood, there's a lot of heat and a lot of pressure used, leaving the final sheets extremely dry. Essentially, they're giant sponges. If all the edges, including the two faces, are not fully sealed with either epoxy or paint, water will sooner or later work its way into the plies, starting to break down the layers and eventually rotting out the wood. With the first layer permanently installed, the second layer can be patterned and fit. In laying out that second layer, there's a lot of care taken to space out the joints, ensuring that there aren't any two layers breaking on the same deck beam. Sometimes this means running the first layer athwartship and the second layer fore and aft. Once the second layer has been cut out and fit, the two layers can be glued together and permanently screwed into place. We ended up using number 16 by 4" stainless steel wood screws.
Plywood as we know it today was first introduced into North America in the early 20th century. That 4x8 sheeted dimensional rotary cut plywood was just starting to be used in the home building industry by the mid to late 1920s. And I had never really thought it had even gotten into the marine industry until after World War II. I thought the advent of the patrol boat or the PT boat and some of the other utility boats that were built for the war effort had really introduced plywood to the marine industry. But much to my surprise, when we were dismantling the Western Flyer's interior, there had been rotary cut Douglas fir plywood used on some of the interior furniture. This is actually one of the drawer bottoms from the galley. This is an original drawer bottom, extremely delaminated. It's been underwater a couple of times in its life. But this is actually a piece of rotary cut Douglas fir plywood from 1937. So much to my surprise, by 1937, at least here in Tacoma, Washington, they were starting to use that rotary cut marine grade plywood.
bring what's over left over.
Hey, that's it. The end of another episode here at the Western Flyer Restoration. I sure hope you enjoyed watching that transformation. It was pretty impressive to see all that plywood go down on the deck in just a few short weeks. It actually went from when you were skipping across deck beams to where there was a nice solid deck to walk on in just maybe 2 or 3 weeks worth of work. So very impressive. I think there were 70 sheets of plywood used to do that. But don't despair. I've already started to work on episode number 25, and I've got some of the filming and some of the editing done, and that'll be coming up here in the next few weeks. And as a little side note, the Northwest Maritime Center, the group that's been putting on the Wooden Boat Festival here in Port Townsend for over 40 years, is doing a virtual Wooden Boat Festival this year.
They're spotlighting 5 or 6 of the projects here in the Northwest, some of the restorations that are going on currently, and they put together these little 20-minute, 25-minute little side pieces that kind of spotlight those projects. And that gets kicked off on September 12th, this coming up September 12th. So look for that. You'll see announcements here on this channel, on Leo's channel. You'll see them all over the web. But until next episode, thanks again for watching.